this is Impact. I'm Celia Hatton. Russian forces withdraw from the strategically important Snake Island in the Black Sea after a massive Ukrainian bombardment. NATO leaders pledge to boost support for Ukraine and increase their military presence in Eastern Europe as they wrap up a meeting in Madrid.
We face the most serious security situation in decades, but we are rising to the challenge with unity and resolve.
I'm Mark Lowen, live in Madrid, where NATO leaders have concluded their crucial EU summit and the biggest overhaul of their collective defence since the Cold War.
The Russian president has accused NATO of having imperial ambitions. We'll be talking to our correspondents in Moscow and Kyiv. President Xi Jinping visits Hong Kong on his first trip out of mainland China since the start of the pandemic, and on Carrie Lam's last day as the territory's leader. A cyber mystery that could involve North Korea. Hackers there are thought to be behind the theft of as much as $100 million in cryptocurrency. That's all coming up on Impact. Welcome to the program. The head of NATO has hailed a transformative meeting of its leaders, saying the military alliance faces the most serious security situation in decades due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Jens Stoltenberg was speaking at the NATO summit in Madrid after Russia's President Vladimir Putin accused the alliance of having imperial ambitions for supplying weapons to Kyiv. In Ukraine itself, Russia says it's withdrawing its forces from Snake Island in the Black Sea, which it captured at the start of the war, describing it as a goodwill gesture. Well, let's go live to Madrid now. Correspondent Mark Lowen is at the NATO summit. So good to hear from you both, Joe Inwood in Kyiv and Steve Rosenberg in Moscow. Well, stay with us on Impact. Still to come. We're live in Hong Kong, where President Xi Jinping is visiting on his first trip out of mainland China since the start of the pandemic. This is Impact on BBC World News. China's President Xi Jinping is in Hong Kong for his first trip outside mainland China in nearly 2.5 years. Mr. Xi has stayed inside the mainland throughout the pandemic, but he's made the trip to the adjoining Chinese territory for a key anniversary. Friday marks 25 years since the handover of Hong Kong from Britain back to China. Okay, Joe Tidy, thank you so much. That was Joe Tidy, our cybersecurity correspondent. Well, we're coming to the end of the program for this half hour, but do check out our website for any more information you'd like on the NATO summit and on Ukraine. Stay with us on BBC World News. Bye-bye. Hello, this is Impact. I'm Celia Hatton. NATO leaders pledge to boost support for Ukraine and increase their military presence in Eastern Europe as they wrap up a meeting in Madrid.
We face the most serious security situation in decades, but we are rising to the challenge with unity and resolve.
A new president in the Philippines, 3 decades after his father was driven from power, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. is sworn in. Political upheaval in Israel. MPs dissolve parliament, paving the way for fresh elections in November. And Japan's electricity grid buckles as people try to keep cool in Tokyo's hottest June since records began. That's all coming up on Impact. Welcome to the program. We return to our top story now. The head of NATO has hailed a transformative meeting of its leaders, saying the military alliance faces the most serious security situation in decades due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Jens Stoltenberg was speaking at the NATO summit in Madrid after Russia's president, Vladimir Putin, accused the alliance of having imperial ambitions for supplying weapons to Kyiv. In Ukraine itself, Russia says it is withdrawing its forces from Snake Island in the Black Sea, which it captured at the start of the war, describing it as a goodwill gesture. Our security correspondent Frank Gardner reports. Well, stay with us on Impact. Still to come, Japan's electricity grid buckles as people try to keep cool in Tokyo's hottest June since records began. This is Impact on BBC World News. Well, let's turn to Japan. It's battling an unprecedented heat wave, and many are getting worried about a possible shortage of electricity to keep air conditioners going. Tokyo recorded another record temperature on Thursday, making it the worst June heat wave in Japan since records began in 1875. Our Tokyo correspondent Rupert Wingfield-Hayes reports. Very exciting to hear what's going on at Wimbledon. Thank you very much, Hatton, for that. Well, let's get some of the day's other news. An official burial ceremony has begun in the Congolese capital, Kinshasa, for the independence leader Patrice Lumumba. He was murdered in 1961 by separatist rebels in collusion with Belgian mercenaries. A gold tooth is all that remains of the country's first prime minister after his body was dismembered and dissolved in acid. A Belgian police officer who oversaw the destruction of his body had once held on to the tooth as a trophy. It was returned to Mr. Lumumba's family last week at a ceremony in Brussels. A bronze cast of The Thinker, widely considered the greatest work of the French sculptor Auguste Rodin, is up for auction in Paris. It's expected to fetch up to $14 million. There are more than 30 casts of The Thinker, but this one of only 10 is thought to be in private ownership. The Thinker was originally intended to represent the poet Dante, but Rodin later decided to create something more universal, representing thought and creative genius. Well, 6 decades after they first stepped on stage at a small music venue in London, the Rolling Stones are still considered one of the greatest rock and roll bands of all time. Well, to celebrate their 60th anniversary, the BBC is releasing a 4-part documentary series showing how the band came together. In one of the programs, Mick Jagger shares where it all began. Let's take a look. Sam Anthony talking about that new BBC series on the Rolling Stones. And now let's go to my part of the world, Canada, and a view of the Niagara Falls that hasn't been seen before. It comes from a tunnel on the Canadian side of the falls, first built in 1905 as a hydroelectric power plant, now transformed into a viewing platform. Tourists descend in a glass elevator and head to the edge of the platform where they can take in this spectacular view of the falls. All right, we are going to cross live now back to Madrid to hear what the US President Joe Biden has to say.
That this has been a historic NATO summit. Some of the folks have been covering me for a while, about a year and a half ago when the first G7 meeting took place in England.
This week, who think that when you put all
Joe
of this
Biden
together,
taking questions there, the US President at his closing press conference at the NATO summit here in Madrid. Moving on to more domestic issues after having addressed the key achievements, as he put it, of this NATO summit. Joe Biden talking about how this was now a stronger, more united NATO alliance. He said it was a historic summit here in Madrid. And he said, I told Putin that if he were to go into Ukraine and to invade, that he would see democracy stand up and defend the rules-based order. And that is exactly, as he says, what has happened. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has strengthened the alliance, and that the world has changed, and that NATO too is changing. He talked about the accession of Finland and Sweden, and how the majority of NATO members have now committed to reach the threshold set by NATO of spending 2% of their GDP on defense. He talked about the US rallying the world in supporting Ukraine, talking about more defense systems and radars and ammunitions being given to Ukraine. And he also talked, interestingly, about China. For the first time, NATO has defined China as a systemic challenge, not perhaps language that is as strong as some NATO members would have wanted, but he talked about the need to get rid of China's abusive practices and forced labor. And he said Putin thought he could break NATO, but he's getting exactly what he didn't want. So a very upbeat assessment of what NATO has achieved in this summit here in Madrid by the US President Joe Biden. A historic summit in many ways, in which NATO has overhauled its collective defense architecture, moving more from deterrence towards forward defense, sending tens of thousands more troops to NATO's vulnerable eastern flank in case of a NATO incursion. The US committing more F-35 fighter jet squadrons, for example, to the UK, and a permanent American army base in Poland, redefining Russia as the main threat to the NATO alliance and standing very squarely behind Ukraine as it continues to resist Russia's aggression. So, what does this all mean for the future of NATO? And to what extent is Joe Biden's... We're going to go back to Joe Biden actually just to carry on listening to a little bit more of him.
In terms of their weapon systems and some of their military systems. More here. Kelly O'Donnell, NBC.
Mr. President, well, you just made some news saying you
Joe
would
Biden
support
continuing to take some more questions there from the international media, talking about how the US will announce $800 million more in military aid to Ukraine, including air defense system and offensive weapons, and saying that the US is supplying Ukraine with the capacity to resist Russian aggression, and that this will not end with Russia's defeat of Ukraine. Also touching on the impact of the Ukraine war on oil prices and gas prices. He was asked about his upcoming trip to Saudi Arabia, and he said he wants an increase in oil production from all Gulf states. Now, as Joe Biden continues to take questions there from the media at the close of this NATO summit, let's bring in Justin Crump, a defense analyst with the risk assessment company Sibylline, who is joining us now live. Thank you very much, Justin. Thank you for your patience in waiting for Joe Biden to continue talking there. In terms of the concrete pledges of this NATO summit, we've heard about the promise of the Rapid Reaction Force going from 40,000 to more than 300,000 troops, shoring up NATO's eastern flank. In your view, are we talking about theoretical troop increases here, given the fact that they're not actually going to be permanently stationed in the Baltic states, for example, or in Romania, Slovakia? I mean, are we talking about a sort of a play with numbers here? How significant is the increase in troops? Justin. Okay, Justin Crump, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your thoughts and for your patience waiting for Joe Biden to speak here in Madrid, where he talked about how NATO is changing and the world is changing. He is talking about how NATO is more united than ever and stronger than ever, and that while Putin, he said, thought he could break NATO, he got the opposite of what he wanted. So the end of the NATO summit here, a historic summit in many ways, changing the defense infrastructure of NATO and also responding to Russia as the direct threat to the NATO alliance. With that, it's back to you.
Hello, this is Impact. I'm Celia Hatton. Russian forces withdraw from the strategically important Snake Island in the Black Sea after a massive Ukrainian bombardment. NATO leaders pledged to boost support for Ukraine and increase their military presence in Eastern Europe as they wrap up a meeting in Madrid.
I don't know how it's going to end, but it will not end with a Russian defeat of Ukraine in Ukraine.
And I'm Kasia Madeira live at the NATO summit in Madrid, where leaders have made very clear that Ukraine's fight is the alliance's fight.
A new president in the Philippines. 3 decades after his father was driven from power, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. is sworn in. And political upheaval in Israel. MPs dissolve parliament, paving the way for fresh elections in November. Welcome to the program. NATO has hailed a transformative meeting of its leaders, saying the military alliance faces the most serious security situation in decades due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In the last hour, President Biden said Russia is paying a very heavy price for invading Ukraine and won't be able to defeat it. He said he would announce a further $800 million worth of military aid for Kyiv in the coming days. In Ukraine itself, Russia is withdrawing its forces from Snake Island in the Black Sea, which it captured at the start of the war. Well, let's go live to Madrid, where the summit is wrapping up. Our correspondent, Kasia Madeira, is there. Joe Inwood and Steve Rosenberg there. Well, stay with us on Impact. Still to come. China's President Xi Jinping arrives in Hong Kong for ceremonies marking the 25th anniversary of the handover of the territory from British to Chinese rule. This is Impact on BBC World News. Well, China's President Xi Jinping is in Hong Kong for his first trip outside mainland China in nearly 2.5 years. Mr. Xi has stayed inside the mainland throughout the pandemic, but he's made the trip to the adjoining Chinese territory for a key anniversary. Friday marks 25 years since the handover of Hong Kong from Britain back to China. What a way to end a program. Cuteness overload in action. And you can get in touch with me and the team on Twitter. Write to me. I'm at Celia Hatton. That's all for us for now on BBC World News.
Hello. The record-breaking heat will continue for a couple more days across Europe.